Welcome to part 3 of today's lecture for Between War and Peace on economic sanctions. The first two parts of the lecture, we've looked at economic sanctions. This part of the lecture, we're going to focus particularly on the case for arms embargoes. As I said at the start of today's lecture, these can be seen as a form of military sanctions. Arms embargoes have been another tool of response to serious conflict and mass atrocities. They've been used by states to tackle many of the major conflicts and mass atrocities over the past 30 years or so, including Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and so on. For instance, in 2015, the UN Security Council approved an embargo against the Houthi rebels in Yemen in response to the intensification of the civil war and the deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Unlike economic sanctions that we looked at in the first part of today's lecture, arms embargoes are widely seen as a potentially positive measure, at least in policy circles and amongst advocacy groups. Now, you can see arms embargoes as a form of economic sanctions, and they're often mentioned as a form of economic sanctions. What this means is that in your assignments, if you want to focus on arms embargoes as this particular form of economic sanctions, you can do so. What are arms embargoes? Well, like economic sanctions, arms embargoes come in different forms. They can be unilateral. An example is the arms embargo imposed by the US on Vietnam, which was only lifted in 2016. They can be regional, such as by the EU on Syria, and they can be imposed by the UN Security Council, such as the arms embargoes imposed on rebels in the Central African Republic in 2013. Secondly, and this is more specific for arms embargoes, they can be impartial, that is applying to all sides of a potential conflict. Examples of impartial arms embargoes are the former Yugoslavia in 1991 and 1998, Somalia in 1992, Liberia in 1992 and 2001, Rwanda in 1994, and Sierra Leone in 1997. Or they may be partial. What this means is that they apply only to one or some groups involved in the conflict or situation. They might be applied, for instance, to rebel groups that are perceived to be acting unjustifiably. Notable examples here include the UNITA rebels in Angola in 1993. Partial arms embargo was imposed upon them. On the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2000, and on Iraq in response to its invasion of Kuwait. Thirdly, arms embargoes can be imposed only on the rebels or on states, or sometimes on both. On the face of it, there are two major reasons in favor of arms embargoes. Firstly, it appears that they can reduce the ferocity of the conflict and the extent of mass atrocities. This is by most straightforwardly reducing the means by which combatants can inflict intended and unintended harms on innocent civilians. Combatants, soldiers, won't be able to undertake as many operations or as extensive operations as they would have been able to if they do not have the means to do so, if they don't have the arms to do so. This is an instrumental reason in favor of arms embargoes. It simply says that there's going to be better consequences, reduced suffering for the population. There's also an intrinsic reason for launching arms embargoes. This is that, so the argument goes, you won't be complicit in the wrongdoing of others. You don't want to, the argument goes, transfer arms to states that are then sold to people who use them to kill innocent civilians, or transfer to people who then use the arms to kill innocent civilians. You should avoid being complicit. Let's, the argument goes, keep our hands clean. Let's not be complicit in others' harms. So, for instance, the UK should not sell arms to Saudi Arabia or transfer arms that might be used for unjust killing. Instead, it should propose and maintain arms embargoes, independent of the question of the consequences for doing so. Intrinsic reason here is that you should maintain an arms embargo, not simply because it's going to reduce the suffering from the population, but it's because you, the state, should not be involved in the harms of others. You should not be complicit in the harms of others. Let's look at some objections. One of the most common objections to arms embargoes is that they are, in fact, counterproductive. The most forceful critique of arms embargoes comes from Dominic Tierney. He argues that much of the impact of UN arms embargoes in civil wars can be summarized as irrelevant or malevolent. Virtually every case of a UN arms embargo applied to a civil war has been a failure. Much of the intuitive promise of arms embargoes, he argues, in civil wars is illusionary, and the increased frequency of their adoption can be contrasted with a dubious record ending or ameliorating conflict. Although arms embargoes, Tierney continues, are often seen as a wise middle option between doing nothing and military intervention, they can, in fact, he says, be the most problematic option. Why is he making these claims? Well, let's unpack what he's saying here. There are three elements to it, three strands to it. The first is the fig leaf objection. This is that states will use arms embargoes as a fig leaf to avoid undertaking more effective measures, such as, on some views, undertaking military intervention. It gives the impression of doing something, thereby potentially quelling domestic demands for action in response to mass atrocities or aggression, without necessitating costly action. So it's a cheap option, is argued, that avoids states having to do more costly, potentially more effective things. For instance, arms embargoes were used to quell the demand to do something in Rwanda, to quell the demand to do something in Yugoslavia, avoiding the need for Western military intervention on a large scale, avoiding the calls to do something. The lack of timely intervention, though, in Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, meant that hundreds of thousands of civilians died. So this is the first strand to this objection, fig leaf objection. There are two replies to this objection. Firstly, although in Bosnia and Rwanda, it seemed like more timely intervention was required, at other times, more coercive options might have been more morally problematic. So perhaps most obviously, a full-scale war might have failed to meet the requirements of jus ad bellum or jus in bello. So the point is this: if the other options are going to be problematic, are going to be unjust, it might actually be a reason in favor of launching arms embargoes if they're going to block them. The second response, and perhaps more notable response, is that arms embargoes are often not an alternative to other options. They're often used alongside more coercive options. So they are typically used alongside military interventions and alongside economic sanctions. The second objection is what we can call the weaken just movements objection. It claims that arms embargoes prevent legitimate states and just rebel movements from being able to defend themselves in the face of an unjust attack. The imposition of arms embargoes stops states, rebel movements that are pursuing just causes from being able to obtain the arms that they require. Take, for instance, the arms embargo on the former Yugoslavia during its breakup. It had the effect of crippling the Bosnian government, which actually needed most support and was the subject of most of the attacks. Other groups were far less affected. The Croats were able to purchase weapons from Eastern Europe, and the Serbs controlled the domestic arms industry and the national army. It seems then that the arms embargo harmed the Bosnians, stopping them from being able to defend themselves, and in particular defend their citizens, who ended up being subject to huge mass atrocities, from being able to defend themselves. The more general worry then is that arms embargoes preclude legitimate actors, states, rebels fighting just causes from being able to defend themselves. A few points I want to highlight about this. Sometimes there might not be a just side to supply arms to, as the war is fought by two or more problematic sides. In fact, you might think that most wars are like this. Most wars are unjust, so it's less of a problem if arms embargoes preclude weapons to both sides. In fact, it might be seen as a significant benefit. In addition, you might think that even if there is a just side, it doesn't follow that they should have access to arms. There are general problems with arming rebels and arming states, even if they are fighting a just cause. For instance, it's very difficult to ensure that arms transfers end up in the hands simply of the just rebels, the rebels pursuing a just cause, rather than ending up in the hands of those who are pursuing more problematic ends. So it might still then be justified, all things considered, to have an arms embargo, because it's so difficult to ensure that the arms end up only in the hands of those pursuing just ends. Finally, even if there is a strong case for providing arms to a particular side, and the arms embargo may be partial, it can make it harder for one side to fight. Finally, even if there still is a strong case providing arms to a particular side, remember that arms embargoes can be partial. They can be applied only to one side, and they can make it harder for, say, the unjust side to be able to fight. Let's look at the third strand to this objection. The third strand to this objection presented by Tierney. It's what we can call the counterproductive objection. It says that arms embargoes do not work and can even be counterproductive. Tierney argues that with only a few partial exceptions, arms embargoes have failed. Why is this? Well, externally, the argument goes, the sender, that is the state that's engaged in the arms embargoes, that's putting the arms embargoes, sending them onto another state, will fail to comply with the embargo. They will continue to supply arms. Why is this? Well, they might have interest in still propping up an ally. Alternatively, they might simply wish to sell arms for financial reasons. The embargo might also be insufficiently monitored or enforced, and states will fail to have significant penalties for failing to comply with it. Internally, the receiver will still be able to obtain arms through porous borders. What that means is that those subject to the arms embargoes might still be able to obtain arms. So they can obtain arms through the black market, for instance. This has an unfortunate result. Arms embargoes can, it's argued, in fact, strengthen criminal elements within regimes, bringing them into the political, economic mainstream and rendering public officials as criminals by forcing them to gain access through illegal sources. So the counterproductive objection says externally, those who are supposed to be signed up to the arms embargo, for instance, approved by the UN Security Council, will still try to sell arms, still have reasons to sell arms. And internally, the states subject to the arms embargo will still try to obtain them through alternative means. Now let's look at some responses here. It's not altogether clear that arms embargoes are in fact counterproductive and in particular ineffective. A lot depends on how we should understand effectiveness. If we understand effectiveness according to whether arms embargoes achieve policy change, it doesn't seem likely that they're going to be able to do much. Stopping the flow of guns, for instance, seems unlikely to get states to give up their territory or leaders to quit their jobs. Policy change is often the way that the effectiveness of sanctions and lots of the other measures that we're going to look at are assessed, whether there's a significant policy change that results. But there's another measure, another way of understanding effectiveness. And on this understanding, arms embargoes might actually be effective. If we judge arms embargoes according to whether they have an impact on how intense the fighting is, which is a fairly good proxy for whether people are being killed, innocent civilians are being killed, soldiers potentially innocent on the revisionist view of just war theory are being killed, it seems that arms embargoes are more likely to be effective. So if we're looking to their effect on intensity of fighting, it seems that they're going to be effective, at least to a greater degree. This is because they will reduce the flow of arms that can fuel conflicts. Indeed, some of the empirical literature on the reading list this week suggests that arms embargoes can be effective once effectiveness is understood in this way. So on this second understanding of effectiveness, you don't look at whether the policy has enacted, the measures that led to policy change. You look at whether the measure has had tangible effects on, in the case of arms embargoes, the intensity of fighting. This reasoning can also be applied to some of the other measures. We could look to this second understanding of effectiveness to see whether there's been tangible effects on, say, human rights abuses, whether there's been a decrease in them, or a decrease in atrocity incidents, or a decrease in some of the aggression by the state, rather than whether there's been a significant policy change. On this understanding of effectiveness, some of the measures that we're going to look at in the later weeks might appear to be more effective than if we adopt the more demanding account of effectiveness, which is policy change. This brings us back to economic sanctions that we looked at in the first part of today's lecture. On this second understanding of effectiveness, on whether sanctions achieve some benefit in terms of reducing the number of human rights abuses or reducing aggression, it's more plausible, but by no means clear-cut, that economic sanctions might have some positive effect. Although, to reiterate, this is deeply contested, and there are several studies that suggest that sanctions also have severe effects, for instance, on human rights. This brings to an end today's lecture. We've explored the ethics of economic sanctions, what are sanctions, difference between targeted and comprehensive sanctions, 3 central deontological or intrinsic objections to economic sanctions, 1 instrumental objection. Then we've looked at arms embargoes, which can be seen as a form of economic sanctions or can be seen as a form of military sanctions. We've seen some of the arguments for arms embargoes, the fact that they are instrumentally potentially desirable or intrinsically involved. It allows states to not be complicit. And we've also seen some of the responses to arms embargoes, claims that they are, for instance, counterproductive. And finally, we've seen that some of this turns on how we understand questions of effectiveness. In next week, we're going to turn to a different form of sanctions, and that is diplomatic sanctions. We're going to focus largely on the questions of naming and shaming, diplomatic criticism, whether states should engage in what's called megaphone diplomacy and criticize other states, for instance, for their human rights records, or whether this is counterproductive and problematic for other reasons.